Made it to where Chris Paul is the scapegoat. He's the problem. Clearly, there's something else going on behind the scenes. So now you get a fresh-minded Chris Paul.
We are talking about the point god, the architect of Lob City, and yet his exit wasn't a hero's farewell, it was a hit job. They treated a legend like he was a liability. But now, the muzzle is off. He is finally airing out the dirty laundry about what actually went down behind those closed doors. And folks, brace yourselves, because this isn't the fairy tale ending. It's ugly. Let's dissect the trade and the absolute mess hiding underneath it. February 4th, 2026. A three-team blockbuster between the Clippers, Brooklyn Nets, and Toronto Raptors. The headline, Chris Paul to the North. The fine print, Ochai Agbaji, a 2032 second rounder, and a bag of cash heading to Brooklyn. Toronto, they just wanted to dodge the luxury tax. Pure business. Dumping Agbaji's contract on the Nets was strictly a wallet-saving move. The Clippers, they were desperate to slash about $7 million in tax penalties and free up a roster seat. Brooklyn played the bank, taking Agbaji. A pick so far in the future will have flying cars by then, and $3.5 million in cold hard cash. $5 million just to eat a contract. 3 franchises. 0 basketball logic. 100% accounting gymnastics. The Nets even threw in the draft rights to Vanja Marinkovic, a guy drafted back in 2019 who is probably enjoying an espresso in Europe right now, just to make the spreadsheets balance out. So CP3 lands in Toronto, and the PR machine starts spinning. Oh, we'll work with him to find a next home. Standard procedure, right? That is the surface level fluff. A boring 3-team swap where the billionaires save some money and the GMs high-five over Excel sheets. But the real story, the one boiling under the surface since early December, that is a powder keg that was waiting to explode. Because trades like this don't just happen in a vacuum. You don't dump a legend for tax relief unless things are toxic. This happened because the Clippers looked at a 12-time All-Star, a future first-ballot Hall of Famer who came home to finish his story and decided he was the problem. And man, did they fumble the bag. Every leak, every whisper just made the front office look more incompetent. It is insane. This is the guy who put Clippers basketball on the map. Lob City, the alley-oops, the swagger. And this is how you repay him? By dragging his name through the mud in his farewell tour? That is just cold. Paul inked a 1-year vet minimum deal, $3.3 million on July 1st, 2025. The Warriors had cut him loose. He was 40. He told the world, this is it, the last ride. He chose the Clippers for one reason, sentiment. This was where he became a superstar, the Lob City era. Blake Griffin, soaring over cars. DeAndre Jordan ending careers at the rim. The playoff battles. He wanted to hang up the jersey right where the Magic started. The front office pitched it as a mentorship. Come teach the kids how to win, Chris. They needed a voice in a quiet locker room. And CP3 bought in. He did the summer grind. He hosted the dinners. He nodded along with Ty Lue's philosophy. On paper, a match made in heaven. But the second the ball tipped off, total disaster. A train wreck in slow motion. Fast forward to December, the vibes were atrocious. Clippers president Lawrence Frank is hitting Paul with final warnings about being divisive. Divisive? The guy is a competitor, Paul and Ty Lue. Ice cold. Hadn't spoken a word to each other in weeks. The silence was deafening. He is getting into screaming matches with associate head coach Jeff Van Gundy. And then, the breaking point. December 2nd, a brutal loss to the Miami Heat. To add insult to injury, the team gets stranded at the airport for 6 hours because the plane broke down. Exhausted, frustrated, they finally drag themselves to a hotel. Midnight. The witching hour. Lawrence Frank knocks on Paul's hotel room door. No pleasantries, just, you're done. Paul tried to fight it. He supposedly even dragged Mo Bamba into the room as a character witness. Imagine that, needing a teammate to prove you aren't a villain at 2 a.m. Frank didn't flinch. The verdict was in. Go home, Chris. The team chartered a flight to Atlanta without him. A Hall of Famer left to book his own commercial flight back to LA like a rookie. 2:40 in the morning, insomnia kicking in. Paul grabs his phone and drops a nuke on Instagram. Just found out I'm being sent home. 5 words and a peace sign emoji. That is all it took to set the NBA world on fire. Every reporter with a smartphone started hunting for the truth. the insiders started chirping. And for the next 2 months, leading up to that February 4th trade, the Clippers organization got exposed, layer by ugly layer. But to really grasp the toxicity, you have to look at the bench. You have to look at the war between Chris Paul and the men wearing the suits. This wasn't a slow burn. This was a forest fire. The friction between Paul and the staff wasn't just creative differences. It was a power struggle. Specific, documented blowups showed a coaching staff that seemed terrified of a veteran who knew more about running an offense than they did. The beef with Jeff Van Gundy? Explosive. It came down to ego. Does a legend get to speak, or does he shut up and dribble? Let's zoom in on the smoking gun. November 29th, 2025. Clippers versus Mavericks. A tight one, 114-110, fourth quarter. Crunch time. Kawhi Leonard checks in after riding the pine for a while. Ty Lue assigns him to guard Klay Thompson. Now, Kawhi is cold, stiff, and Klay Thompson, he is a flamethrower. He is scorching the nets. CP3 is watching this nightmare unfold from the bench, and his instincts kick in. He speaks up. He does what he has done for 21 years. He tries to win the game. Chris Haynes broke it down perfectly. It was a timeout during that Mavs game. The last stand at home, tension was through the roof that occurred from a game against the Dallas Mavericks. Their last home game they played, it was in the fourth quarter. You can feel the pressure just thinking about it. You have to picture the scene. Kawhi Leonard is playing on a strict minute restriction, basically held together by tape and hope, and sources tell me he was absolutely gassed trying to chase Klay Thompson around screens. He wasn't just struggling, he was getting torched. Leonard had been sitting on the bench getting cold, and trying to keep up with Klay's movement was like trying to catch smoke with your bare hands. The bleeding had to stop, so a timeout was called late in the fourth quarter with the game hanging in the balance. And in that huddle during the most critical moments of the fourth, Chris Paul walked straight up to Kawhi Leonard, looked him in the eye, and asked the hard question, "Hey man, are you fresh enough? You feel good?" He pressed him, asking, "Do you honestly feel like you can stick with Klay right now?" Then Paul turned to the rest of the squad and said, "Hey, y'all might want to switch this matchup before it's too late." Let's be clear here. Paul suggested switching the defensive assignment. He didn't bark an order. He didn't try to steal the clipboard. He simply asked Leonard if his legs were there. He told his teammates to consider putting a fresh body on Thompson until Leonard could actually get warm and move his feet. It was a veteran suggestion made in the heat of battle because, frankly, Thompson had already buried 5 or 6 three-pointers at that point. The guy was unconscious. The team listened, and they ended up switching the matchup. But the drama didn't stay on the court. The very next day, 30,000 feet in the air on the team plane, associate head coach Jeff Van Gundy called a tense meeting with Paul. Van Gundy grilled Paul, asking point blank if he had hijacked the defensive assignment during the game. Paul looked him dead in the eye and said no. He stood his ground. He had made a suggestion to win the game, not a command to undermine the coach. To prove he wasn't lying, Paul literally stood up on the plane, marched down the aisle, and called on Kawhi Leonard and Chris Dunn to testify right there in front of everyone. He asked them to confirm his version of the story. It was a public challenge, and it only poured gasoline on the fire. Van Gundy wasn't having it. He reportedly told Paul that while he might have had the freedom to make those calls on his old teams, things were different here. He told him straight up, "You do not have that leeway here." That word leeway stuck in Paul's craw like a bone. Just days before they cut him loose on November 28th, Paul posted an Instagram story that was just a screenshot of the dictionary definition of the word leeway. At the time, it was a mystery. Fans were scratching their heads. But now the puzzle pieces fit perfectly. Van Gundy had used that exact word to shut down Paul's basketball IQ. And Paul threw it right back up on his Instagram in a moment of silent, petty rebellion. As insider Chris Haynes explained, this wasn't an isolated flare-up. It was just one explosion in a minefield of verbal incidents between the two in a shockingly short amount of time. I was told specifically that Jeff Van Gundy looked Chris Paul in the face and said, "Listen, you might have had leeway in other places to change defensive coverages, but you don't have that leeway here." And folks, that plane ride was just the tip of the iceberg. It was one of several minor verbal brawls between a legendary point guard and a stubborn coach. The tension was constant. The confrontations with Van Gundy weren't just bad days at the office, they were a pattern. There was another brutal incident on the bench during a stretch where Paul was glued to the pine for 5 consecutive games, a dreaded DNP-CD for a Hall of Famer. Paul and Van Gundy were sitting right next to each other on the sideline. It was like an unhappy couple at a dinner party. Neither spoke a word for what felt like an eternity. The silence was suffocating until Paul finally snapped, asking Van Gundy with dripping sarcasm, "Oh, so you're just not talking to me now?" Van Gundy just scoffed and questioned if Paul was even being serious. Multiple sources saw this go down. It was awkward, it was messy, and it was happening in plain sight. It illustrated just how personal the beef had become, a veteran desperate to contribute and an assistant coach who viewed that contribution as a direct threat to his authority. Meanwhile, Paul's relationship with head coach Ty Lue was deteriorating on a separate, equally disastrous track. Early in the season, they were tight. They had collaborated all summer, plotting the championship run. But as the losses piled up and the Clippers stumbled to a horrific 5-16 start, the vibe shifted. Paul's critiques of the coaching decisions got louder, sharper, and Ty Lue's patience wore thin. The boiling point hit on November 8th, 2025. After a game where Paul was benched for the entire second half, he called Lue. That call turned into a 40-minute war. Paul demanded to know why his role was shrinking. The conversation got heated, voices were raised, and bridges were burned. That was the last real conversation they ever had. For weeks after that blowout argument, Paul and Lue were effectively strangers. They weren't on speaking terms. Paul reportedly begged for meetings to address the whispers that he was a negative presence in the locker room. Lue shut him down. He refused to meet. On November 9th, the very next day after that phone call from hell, Paul met with executive Lawrence Frank, who issued a final warning: stop being divisive or else. 2 days later, on November 11th, an off day after a tough loss to the Atlanta Hawks, Paul was allowed to address the team. He stood up and apologized. He tried to explain that his critiques came from a good place, that he just wanted the group to stop losing and start improving. But honestly, it didn't matter. The cracks in the foundation were already too deep to fix. 3 weeks later, they packed his bags and sent him home from Miami. Former player and analyst J.J. Redick, who battled alongside Paul during the Lob City days, broke down exactly why the coaching staff's ego was the real villain here. He said the emphasis on getting it right has to be much more important than the emphasis on being right. When you're obsessed with being the boss, getting a play correct on paper might mean you overlook the right move to actually win the game. You've got a million things flying at you in the clutch, right? Especially at the end of games, it's total chaos out there. So, as a coach, you'd think you would welcome ideas from a basketball genius on how to survive, and then, deal with the ego stuff the next day after you've slept on it. Approach the situation in a non-confrontational way once the adrenaline wears off. But the coaching staff chose confrontation. They chose hierarchy and chain of command over collaboration and winning. And when the dust settled and the truth came out, it painted a picture of coaches who would rather silence a Hall of Famer than actually listen to him. But the coaching drama was only half the story. What was going down inside that locker room, that was just as revealing and twice as ugly. The sideline screaming matches, that was just the smoke. The real fire was burning somewhere else, somewhere much quieter. The locker room told the real story. And honestly, that silence did way more damage to the Clippers brand than any shouting match ever could. It exposed a culture that was completely hollow, rotten from the inside out. You had a room full of guys on max contracts, sitting 5 feet apart, acting like strangers on a subway, highly paid mercenaries who barely spoke a word to each other. And look at the captains of this sinking ship. 2 superstars who treated leadership like it was an optional side quest. They preferred the mute button. During the 2025-2026 season, insiders described that locker room as a morgue. Unusually silent, zero vibe, minimal interaction once the cameras turned off. The team group chat was a digital wasteland. It was strictly business logistics, flight times, bus schedules, no banter, no memes, no pulse. Nobody was talking, and nobody was taking the wheel. Kawhi Leonard, the face of the franchise, stayed in his lane. He's always been about that low-key life, head down, hoodie up, obsessed with his own prep work, but allergic to rallying the troops. Then you had James Harden, the scoring genius, who was laid back to the point of being horizontal. Neither of them stepped up to fill that massive leadership void that every struggling team desperately needs to survive. Enter Chris Paul. He walks into this library and decides to start a heavy metal band. He tried to shock the system. He lit up the group chat. He forced guys to hang out off the court, tried to manufacture some chemistry. He pushed for real, open dialogue. In film sessions, he didn't sugarcoat it. He pointed fingers. He addressed performance issues head on. He did exactly what he's done on every single roster he's graced for 20 years. He demanded accountability. But this locker room, they treated accountability like an infectious disease. They didn't want to hear it. As one insider put it, Paul's reputation for grinding his teammates' gears wasn't a secret, it was a feature. That dark cloud has followed him for over a decade. I've been hearing the whispers for years. People dance around it, but let's just keep it a buck. They say he's a dick. They told me not to say it, but I'm saying it. The reputation is that he's a jerk, that he wears people down until they snap. Teammates will tell you straight up, the guy is absolutely exhausting to be around. He is historically hard to get along with. Think about Allen Iverson. The answer. He was late to practice his entire career, and nobody blinked because he dropped 40 on your head. But the second he lost that first step in Philly, suddenly being late was a moral failing. Why? Because the production stopped. Chris Paul has always been a pest. He's always worn on people. But now that you aren't the point guard giving me 20 points and 10 assists, now that you can't carry us every night, they don't want to hear the lecture. That comparison to Allen Iverson hits the nail right on the head. Paul's intensity was his trademark. When he was the best player on the floor, we called it championship leadership. When he became a 40-year-old on a veteran minimum deal catching DNP CDs, that same energy was just nagging Grandpa. The message didn't change. The messenger just got old. But the context shifted. Especially with Kawhi Leonard, Paul was constantly in his ear offering unsolicited advice, chirping about spacing, strategy, little details. At first, it looked like respect. But fast forward a few months, Leonard was reportedly sick and tired of the constant noise. He's trying to manage his knees, manage his load, and here comes Chris barking orders. Leonard respects the Hall of Fame resume, sure, but the constant input, it was draining him dry. When the axe finally fell and Paul was cut, Leonard and Harden didn't get a phone call. They found out on social media, like the rest of us, zero consultation. Publicly, they played the shocked card. But privately, sources say there was a collective sigh of relief in that locker room. The vibe vampire was finally gone. Harden's situation was messy from Jump Street. When the Clippers asked him about signing Paul that summer, he wasn't exactly throwing a parade. He was hesitant. He knew exactly how demanding Paul could be. He had the scars to prove it. He remembered Houston, 2017 to 2019. He remembered the clashes over style, the bickering, the stress. So after Paul got waived in December, Harden played the diplomat in front of the mics. It's not just Chris, it's the front office, blah, blah, blah. But read between the lines, Harden had seen this movie before. He wrote the screenplay. He knew exactly how the third act ended. One guy who wasn't stunned by the implosion, James Harden himself. And let's not ignore the elephant in the room, the head coach. Insiders confirmed there was an ice-cold war brewing between Paul and the staff that accelerated the whole breakdown. From what I'm hearing from players around the league this week, the tension between Paul and Tyronn Lue was thick enough to cut with a knife. It grew all season like a tumor. By the end, Tyronn Lue didn't just want him quiet, he wanted him gone. But here's the real tragedy for the Clippers. It wasn't that Paul clashed with people. CP3 clashes with everybody. That happens on every team. The problem was the franchise had zero tools to fix it. No mechanism for repair, no mediation, no come to Jesus meeting. Nobody locked Paul, Lue, and Van Gundy in a room and said, nobody leaves until we fix this. Instead, the coaching staff just froze him out. Management sent warnings like passive-aggressive roommates, and finally, they just sent him packing in the dead of night. The culture wasn't just quiet, it was cowardly, it was avoidant. When things got awkward, the organization chose amputation instead of therapy. Removal over resolution. Udonis Haslem, a guy who bleeds Miami Heat culture and knows what a real locker room looks like, said the bare minimum is a conversation. Paul never got that courtesy. Haslem kept it real. I'm the type of guy who refuses to let one person sink 15. So, if you're the toxicity, if you're the one disrupting the mission, you have to go. Simple as that. Look, when you're talking about a legend like Chris Paul, if he's your guy, you don't just cut him out. He earned the right to sit across from the head coach and hash it out. I'm planting my flag on that hill. I am standing 10 toes down on that statement. As a former player, T. Lue knows the code inside that locker room better than anyone. There has to be an open door policy. It doesn't matter if you hate what the player's saying, you owe him that respect. It's about man-to-man communication. You have to clear the air. Even if we agree to disagree, at least we looked each other in the eye and got it off our chests. The irony here was thick enough to choke on. The Clippers begged Paul to come in and be a leader. So, guess what? He led. But apparently, they didn't like what real leadership looked like when it started bruising egos in the front office. Instead of adapting, they cut the cord and slapped a mutual parting label on it. But let's be real, the rot wasn't just on the hardwood or in the locker room. It went straight up the elevator to the executive suite. It went right to the ownership and the front office, who pulled a vanishing act. Lawrence Frank hid behind a press release the day they sent Paul packing. He put out some generic statement saying the Clippers were parting ways with Chris and that his time with the squad was a wrap. He called Chris a legendary Clipper, talked about his historic career, all the fluff. He claimed nobody blamed Chris for the team stumbling and that he, Lawrence Frank, personally took the heat for the record. Those were just words on a screen. Stephen A. Smith? He wasn't buying a single syllable of that corporate speak. He looked dead into the lens and let it fly. I don't give a damn what Lawrence says. I don't like what he did, period. Now, I don't have a deep relationship with Lawrence Frank, but I've always had respect for the man. I remember when he was running the show for the Nets. I remember when he was the head coach of the Detroit Pistons. And then he dropped the hammer, asking the question every fan was screaming at their TV. How the hell do you do Chris Paul like that? We are talking about a future first ballot Hall of Famer in his swan song. I don't care about the chaos on the roster. The team is absolute trash right now. Let's keep it a buck. They have the most unreliable superstar in the history of the sport. But this level of organizational malpractice went way beyond a clumsily worded press release. The details that leaked about the night of December 2nd bleeding into December 3rd were staggering. It was amateur hour. After getting smacked by the Miami Heat, the team plane breaks down. They're stranded on the tarmac for 6 hours. Nightmare fuel. They finally drag themselves to a hotel around midnight. That is when Lawrence Frank knocks on the door to deliver the axe. Paul was done. Totally blindsided. He starts pleading his case, pouring his heart out about why he needed to stay. He talked about his legacy, his desire to mentor the young guys, his willingness to come off the bench, whatever it took. He even dragged a teammate into the room to vouch for him. Frank was stone cold, didn't budge. The next morning, the team flies to Atlanta, and they leave Chris Paul behind to book his own commercial flight home like a tourist. The Clippers didn't even have the decency to break the news first. The story blew up because of an Instagram post in the dead of night. They lost control of the narrative completely. They let a 40-year-old icon post a screenshot at 2:40 in the morning, and that became the headline. Stephen A. lost his mind over the disrespect. You drag him on a road trip just to send him home? You send him home like a dog? This isn't about basketball anymore. We can debate CP3's Hall of Fame credentials all day, and I know we will, but don't you sit there and tell me he deserves to be treated like garbage. But what turned this from a mistake into a full-blown franchise crisis was the radio silence from the very top. Steve Ballmer, the billionaire owner, went ghost. No phone call, no text, absolutely nothing after the decision was made. This is a guy worth over $100 billion who watched Chris Paul legitimize his franchise during the Lob City era. Paul made the Clippers relevant in a town owned by the Lakers, and Ballmer couldn't even pick up the phone? Blake Griffin caught wind of it and called it out immediately. He said he was disappointed for Chris and disappointed in the franchise, specifically pointing a finger at Ballmer's lack of class. Lou Williams jumped in with the real context, hinting that Paul's criticism of the front office was the final nail in the coffin. That was the straw that broke the camel's back. Basically, the front office was more offended by Paul pointing out their failures than they were interested in actually fixing the team. So for 2 excruciating months, from December 3rd, 2025 to February 4th, 2026, the Clippers kept Paul in purgatory. He was showing up to the NBA-owned facility, staying ready, sweating it out in the gym, just waiting for the phone to ring. The Clippers were literally paying him to sit on his couch. They couldn't find a trade partner. Why? Because who wants a one-year veteran minimum deal attached to that much drama? Teams were terrified to bring that circus into their locker room mid-season. The entire limbo period was a masterclass in failure. They couldn't integrate him back into the squad. They couldn't fire him cleanly, and they couldn't trade him quickly. They just let the situation rot until the trade deadline forced their hand. Stephen A. connected the dots, blaming this dysfunction on a long track record of questionable moves defining the Lawrence Frank era. Lawrence Frank is more of a cancer to this team than any player could ever be. Look at what they've done. Is this not the same man who traded Shai Gilgeous-Alexander and 4 picks for Paul George? Is this not the man who stood by and let Kawhi Leonard basically blackmail y'all into gutting the team just so he wouldn't sign with the Lakers? That happened on Lawrence Frank's watch. And now you have the nerve to scapegoat Chris Paul? Give me a break. You really gonna look me in the eye and tell me that's how you disrespect a future first ballot Hall of Famer? A guy who's been the consummate professional in this league for 2 decades? The former president of the Players Association? I mean, give me a break. Seriously, pull up a chair and listen close, because I am just getting warmed up here. The front office didn't just fail Chris Paul, they completely ghosted him. 2 months of total radio silence while he's left twisting in the wind. But let's be honest, if you know this franchise, none of this is shocking. It's not a bug, it's a feature. This is a pattern, folks. A toxic blueprint that stretches back decades. You want to know why the curse feels real? You want to know why disaster keeps knocking on the Clippers' door? The Chris Paul saga didn't happen in a vacuum. It's just the latest episode in a 40-year season of organizational rot. It fits a pattern of behavior that has stalked this team like a shadow. We're talking about a legacy of mishandling talent, botched communications, and making cutthroat decisions that prioritize a quick fix over long-term respect. They treat loyalty like a liability. And look, the dark cloud that hangs over every single decision here, it's the Donald Sterling scandal of 2014. You can't wash that stain out easily. Sterling owned this team for 33 years, and he was caught on tape spewing absolute filth, racist remarks that shook the league to its core. He was attacking black people, throwing shade at Magic Johnson, and telling his girlfriend she couldn't even bring black friends to the games. It was vile. NBA Commissioner Adam Silver had to drop the hammer, banned him for life, slapped him with a $2.5 million fine, and forced the sale to Steve Ballmer for a then-record $2 billion. That scandal didn't just break news, it broke a team. It erupted right in the middle of the Lob City playoffs, completely derailing what could have been a championship run. But the warning signs were there way before. Former executive Elgin Baylor sued Sterling back in 2009 for age and racial discrimination, calling out what he described as a plantation mentality. The suit got dismissed, sure, but it left a scar, a deep one. It told you exactly what kind of operation was running behind closed doors. And here's the kicker, even after Ballmer bought the team with all his energy and cash, that organizational culture never fully hit the reset button. The Sterling years embedded a deep-seated dysfunction that successive management groups just can't seem to scrub away. Under Ballmer, sure, the spending went through the roof. The payroll ballooned like crazy. They built the Intuit Dome, the Taj Mahal of basketball, but the way they treat human beings, that didn't change one bit. Remember 2018? The Clippers traded Blake Griffin to the Detroit Pistons just months after signing him to a 5-year, $171 million extension. They pitched him as a Clipper for life. Griffin came out later and said it straight. The team looked him in the face and lied. They said they were rebuilding around him, DJ, and CP3. It was a fairy tale with a horror ending. That trade was cold-blooded. It was widely criticized as deceptive and disrespectful, the exact kind of move that makes players look at the logo and wonder if a handshake means anything in that building. And then there was Paul George. After years of battling alongside Kawhi, George walked in 2024 free agency. He went to the Sixers on a 4-year max deal because the Clippers wouldn't match it. Why? Luxury tax concerns. Can you believe that? George went on his podcast and spilled it all, describing how he felt totally undervalued, like he was just a line item on a spreadsheet. The front office decided to pinch pennies on a team owned by one of the wealthiest human beings on planet Earth, and they pushed away a superstar in his prime. Make it make sense. And don't get me started on the ongoing soap opera of managing Kawhi Leonard. The man's knees have been a chronic issue, causing him to miss the entire 2021-22 season and massive chunks of every year since. The Clippers' medical staff prioritized long-term health to such an extreme that it basically paralyzed the team's chemistry. You can't get playoff ready when your best player is treated like a museum exhibit. Teammates got frustrated, the locker room got tense, even opposing players started cracking jokes about it during games. It became a punchline. Stephen A. Smith has been screaming about this hypocrisy for years, and the Chris Paul situation just proved him right. It put the double standard on full display for the world to see. You know what Stephen A. says? He's spending his money wrong. He's investing it all backwards. It's like buying a Ferrari and leaving it under a tarp. He's made the wrong investment. How many times have I been on national TV asking, why are you doubling down on Kawhi Leonard? You talk about somebody that should be sent home. You know why you can't send him home? Because you can't send Kawhi home if he is always at home. The man is always home. He works from home more than an accountant during a pandemic. And then Jerry West leaving, that added a whole other layer to this dysfunction sandwich. We are talking about the logo. The legendary executive who helped recruit Kawhi and PG. He left in 2020 because he felt marginalized. He went to the Lakers, the rivals, because he felt disrespected. When one of the greatest basketball minds in the history of the sport walks away because he feels sidelined, that tells you everything you need to know about how this organization values input from people who actually know how to win rings. All of these incidents, Griffin, PG, Kawhi, Jerry West, they created a cumulative reputation among every player and agent in the league. The verdict is in. The Clippers are not a place where loyalty pays off. It's not a place where communication is real. They have the billions. They have the shiny new arena. They have the LA market, but they do not have the culture. And doing Chris Paul dirty was just the latest, most public failure in a long list of them. But through it all, you have to hand it to CP3. He kept his composure. He stayed classy. When he finally broke his silence on the Kevin Hart and Kenan Thompson show, he didn't trash the franchise. He didn't drop names or burn bridges. He just spoke from the heart. He said, listen, I'm in the gym working out and training every single day, okay? I'm staying ready, in all honesty, with the way all that stuff went down. I think for me, I just love this game too much. I don't want it to end like that, not on a sour note. You know what I'm saying? I've enjoyed the ride. I've enjoyed the time, for sure. I get a chance to go to my kids' games now, which is a blessing, but I don't know yet. I'm not done. He didn't need to say anything else. Chris Paul's legacy with the Clippers is already cemented. It will always be defined by Lob City. It's defined by the wins, the highlight reels, and the transformation of a franchise that was a league-wide joke into something people actually paid money to watch. He saved them once shame they couldn't show him the same respect back. But this final chapter, it didn't just close the book. It rewrote the entire narrative with a cold, brutal truth that's going to sting for a long time. And here is the kicker. The part that really hurts, the Clippers have absolutely nowhere to hide. They can't point fingers at the refs, the bad luck, or the basketball gods. No, they have to stare right into the mirror. Because this disaster, it was 100% homemade. Appreciate you riding out the drama with us today. If you live for these deep dives and want to keep the adrenaline pumping, don't let the clock run out. Smash one of those boxes flashing right there on your screen. We have got plenty more heat, controversy, and untold stories queued up for you, so don't sit on the bench, click through, and let's keep this momentum rolling.